The oral history microphone is on the air again. This is Ray Mofield, and we're visiting in, I guess this is West Oaks subdivision at Benton. And we're visiting in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Usrey, and we're going to interview Eileen Gillum Usrey. Thank you for letting me come.
We're so glad you're here, Ray.
We always start out and we try to set the picture of the genealogy of the family. Would you mind telling us, you were born in Benton, or nearby, I guess?
I was born in Scale.
Scale? Why,
the city of Scale.
That's Janie Bell's area.
She probably can tell you more about this than I can.
And you're at least 65 years old.
Yes.
And tell us who your father and mother were.
My father was Otis Gillum, and my mother was Lula Johnson Gillum.
Now, do you know anything about further back than that? What about the grandparents on either or both sides?
Yes, I know. I can go back about 3 or 4 generations on my mother's side, the Oliver side.
Well, good.
And about 3 or 4 generations on Johnson's side.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing on the Pace side. My grandmother Gillum was a Pace, but I can only go back 2 generations on my grandfather Gillum's side.
Mm-hmm. Well, just trace that out any way you'd like to do it.
Well, I wouldn't like to trace it out because that's about all I know about them. I have done very little work on it, but I've been able to find out the names. My family tree on my grandmother Johnson's side follows about the same pattern that of Riley Johnson and some of these other Johnsons that you've talked to. Nancy Ford, Alfred Johnson was my grandfather, and Harrison Johnson, my great-grandfather, Larder, my great-great-grandfather, and back of him, Absalom. And on my grandmother Johnson's side she was Julia Oliver, and her mother was Lula Oliver, Lula and William. Their great-grandparents were Shadrach and Sarah Vaughn Oliver, and that's as far as I can go with her. And I know that a funny story she told me about Shadrach. He lived with them when he was old, and they had company at one time, and she was a little nervous, so she called him Uncle, and she said, Uncle Sugar, will you have shade in your coffee? And then on the Pace side, my father's side, whose mother was a Pace, she was the only daughter in her family. Her father was Perry Shelby Pace, and her mother was Lucinda Elliott Pace. And Daniel and Lettuce Pace, the great-grandparents, and Spencer Pace, the great-great-grandfather.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe you've done better than almost anybody I ever interviewed.
No, I've done it in a hurry, and I've copied some from other people.
In other words, you prepared. That's good. Norman Castleberry tells me he thinks he can go back further than anyone, maybe to 900
yes.
A.D. I told him I couldn't trace any of mine, but we could go back to Noah and Adam, couldn't we?
Absolutely. All of us. All of us.
Well, that's fine. Now, you were born at Scale. I learned in an interview the other day that there was a school at Scale. Did you go there?
I probably went a couple of weeks, but that's all. We moved before I could finish the year.
Now, this fellow I was talking to had gone to Oak Valley for a while.
And I went there, but that was several years later. I went there a month, several years later. Mm-hmm. See, my grandparents lived there, and there were times where my family would let me stay with them, and my family moved back to Scale a couple of times because of sickness or other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Then where did you go? Benton?
Well, we moved from Scale. Would you like to know my earliest memories of Scale?
Oh, sure. I certainly would.
Okay. The very first thing I can remember is a sale, an auction sale that they had at the brick house there at Scale. And remember that we bought a large mirror, which we had all our lives, and it was sold when my mother broke up housekeeping and went to the long-term care unit. Not only that, that brick house was in the location that my father's grandparents lived. And he told the story so many times of his grandmother being very fond of him, and she, in her senility, she thought they had hid my father up in the loft, and she would go and hold her apron over the opening in the loft and say, "Come down, Otis, I'll catch you." I've heard him tell that so many times. And then we moved to Benton from Scale. I think we moved to what would now be 12th and Walnut, but that was the city limits. I don't even know if the city came that far. You know where I'm talking about?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And there was a path, a cow path, in front of the house, and the children played there. There was a huge barn behind us. I remember playing in the hay in that loft, and the neighborhood children came to play there. There was no bridge over the creek there, because that was not the Mayfield Road then, you know. Mayfield Road went through Cole's Addition. And behind the house there were fields where there were cows grazing, and at that time my greatest excitement, I guess, was getting in the buggy with my mother and father and hitching up the horses and going back to Scale to stay all night with my grandparents.
Oh, yes.
And I remember one especially exciting ride I had in the horse and buggy was my grandfather Gillum took me to Paducah, my grandfather and grandmother, and in a horse buggy. It took us all day to get there, and we visited my aunt there. And on the way back, I asked my grandfather for some candy, and he said, "No, that will make you thirsty." But we went a short way, and he bought me some popcorn. And we had to stop on the way at a house where we saw a well and get some water for me.
Oh, you talk about going to Do you remember a school book that had a poem in it about over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go?
Yes.
And it showed a picture of the whole family in a buggy or a surrey or some such thing.
I do.
The dog was running along beside, and a little boy and a girl were just grinning from ear to ear, and he was throwing his cap in the air. One of the last lines said something about "Hurrah for the pumpkin pie."
Yes, that was a Thanksgiving poem.
Yeah.
I was talking to Jody a minute ago, and she was telling me that Paul Gillum, my father's father, who was a minister, had one byword, and said she could just hear him cutting wood and hurting himself, and then said, "You old wheel horse." That was his byword.
Yeah.
Anytime he was mad or aggravated.
Well, that wasn't very violent.
No,
was it?
not
No.
too. So, my father sold insurance while we were here, but I guess he didn't get rich at it, because I remember hearing that he took an examination to be a rural mail carrier. And I remember hearing him tell my mother that he was on a eligibility list, but we'd have to move to Calvert City for 6 months to be eligible. And so we moved. I went about 2 months in the first grade here, and then we moved to Calvert City. Lived down there 5 years.
So in your formative years, you were in Calvert City
Yes.
on the north
Well,
side.
at least 5
Do you remember
years.
any of the teachers you had there?
I remember my first grade teacher, Miss Maud Grubbs. I remember one teacher at Calvert City, Miss Ann Smith, and Walter Bloomingberg. You may know him.
Walter Bloomingberg. Well, that was my wife's uncle.
I know.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. He was my 6th grade teacher. We had a wonderful time at Calvert City for a while until my father became ill. He with some other men bought a lake called Clear Pond. I don't know what it's called now, and I don't even know if it's still there. I think it's almost filled. Are you familiar with that?
No, I haven't heard of Clear
You haven't
Pond.
heard of Clear Pond?
No.
Well, it was about a mile long at the time, and I suppose about a quarter of a mile wide, and a wonderful fishing lake. At least we thought so until we became familiar with what we have now. But at any rate, the people in Calvert City would get up before daylight and drive over to Clear Pond to fish. And then they built, after a while, they built a clubhouse there. There were about 20 people that built a clubhouse there. They bought the pond and built the clubhouse, and we'd go over and stay all night and cook outside. And we just thought we had the best time. And Mr. George Long from Benton was one of the men I know in the group, and Dr. Faust and the Draffins and my father, and I don't remember any others right at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Did your dad ever get that mail carrier job?
Yes, he did. He carried the mail down there for about 5 years, and he became ill with pellagra, and he was very, very ill, but the case was difficult to diagnose. Finally, he went to doctors here, and he went to went to Dr. Washburn, of course, and to Dr. Jackson, I believe, in Paducah, and finally Dr. Jackson said, "You have pellagra," and he says, "Your doctor in Benton told me you had it." So Dr. Washburn had really done the job.
Yeah.
And he
probably with taking some vitamins and so on, that could now be cured easily.
Well, you don't hear of it much.
Uh-huh.
People eat better too, you know.
Yeah.
But my father was ill about 2 years, and somehow, I don't know, he managed, I don't know exactly how he managed, but he had substitute mail carrier, and finally traded routes with Richard Cope here in Benton. He traded his Calvert City route with Richard Cope, and he wasn't quite able to go to work at the time the trade was made, so we moved back to Scale for a short while. So you see, I've had several contacts, and that was when I went to Oak Valley to school.
Uh-huh.
And from Scale, as soon as he was able, we moved to Benton. We moved on Ollie Street down about 2nd and Ollie, somewhere down there, for a short while, and he was still recuperating. And then we moved out to what I'd call the corner of the Senior Citizens Building and Road and Walnut Street. I guess that is out through Cole's Addition, isn't it? Okay, we moved out there, and then we moved back down to the Clark. You know what the Clark Hunt store was?
Oh yes, I remember that.
Across from the motel. It was across. We moved there a short while, and the reason we moved so much was because he had bought a house from Miss Isla Griffith for $1,100. I remember waiting and waiting. He told my mother that he thought he could get that house for $1,100, and he finally did. But we had to wait to get occupancy. That's why we moved around so much. Every time we'd rent a house, it'd be sold or something. And that was the house that we lived in for 42 years on 12th Street.
42 years.
Uh-huh. Where the apartments are now, you know. And let's see, where am I?
Now, did you have any brothers and sisters?
Oh, yes, I'm the oldest of 6 children. Blewett, we called him, Julia, who's Julia Collier, and John, and Jody Dunn, and Bill, my youngest brother.
So it was a relatively large family.
It seemed that way, but when we lost the 2 boys, and we lost Mother and Daddy, now we feel that we have a very small family.
Oh, of course.
Because we have some distant cousins, you know.
Now, if you lived there 42 years, I assume that you finished the 8th grade in Benton.
We moved from Calvert City when I was in the 7th or 8th grade. I don't remember just exactly which it was. I did finish 8th grade in Benton.
So you went to Benton High School?
Benton High School. Mr. Chambers was the superintendent, and everybody who ever went to high school when he was there would remember how he would blow the chalk and write on the board. I don't know if anybody ever mentioned that to you.
No, I hadn't heard that story.
We all knew about it. He made his announcements by writing them on the board, and he'd blow the chalk first, you know. I guess that was so it would write better. The house that we moved in, the Griffith house, was so old that it was built with square nails. It was it had a brick back room that was 22 by 22, which became Mother and Daddy's bedroom, and it had a fireplace in it, and we ended up by staying in it. It's like a den now. There was a bed, but there was also a sofa and chairs, and we had fireplace in there.
Oh, yes. Well, that would
Very
be a
livable.
large room. 22 by 22 is huge
For a bedroom,
for a home.
it is,
Yeah, for a home bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. Mr. Chambers was principal, superintendent, so on. Do you remember anyone else that was there at the time? Was Miss
yes.
Addie Fawn around?
Addie Fawn was my English teacher, and I'm very glad because I felt I accomplished a great deal in English under her. Matt Sparkman was there, and Waylon Rayburn.
Now, Waylon was county judge of Callaway and later
Right.
went with Woodman of the World and was the district Rotary governor. Now, he married a Benton girl.
Mary Ely.
Mary Ely. Uh-huh.
Joe P. Ely's sister, if you remember Joe P.
Oh, yes. He was in the post office.
Yes, right.
I remember him.
I asked Margaret Heath. I haven't heard anyone, I haven't talked to anyone who could remember a movie house being on the west side of the courthouse.
No, they're all talking about the east side of the square.
Well, Mark, I thought I remembered a movie house on the west side of the courthouse because I went to see Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I nearly cried myself to death. And I was positive it was there, and I called Margaret to check. She said that that's true.
Uh-huh.
And Mathis Cafe was on one side of it, and Mr. Strauss' store, and then I believe the two drugstores were there at that time.
Well, you've come up with something that we've never unearthed before. That's
Well,
really great.
I'd never heard anyone mention it, and I was afraid I was getting it wrong.
About what year would that have been? Do you have a general idea?
It was when I was in the eighth. Well, I went into the 8th grade when I was 13 years old, and I was born in 1915, so that'd be about 1927 or 28.
Mm-hmm. Now, you finished high school in at Benton, and you taught school, I know, so you must have gone to college somewhere.
Yes, I went to Murray. I got a degree in math and physics at Murray in 1935, 3 years after I finished high school, but I went summer and winter.
Math and physics. Now, that seems a little bit unusual for...
Well, anyone who taught math at that time had to coach basketball, and nobody wanted me to coach basketball. So I finally I got a job the first year I was out of school teaching 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades at Calvert City. So I went back to Calvert.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught there a year, and then I taught out in the country 1 year at Plainview. And then I came to Benton for 3 years, and then I went elsewhere. I taught in Tennessee, Illinois. I taught 27 years in Illinois.
What town was that?
Charleston,
Eastern Illinois University.
I taught for them.
Mm-hmm.
I taught 1st grade for them.
Mm-hmm.
And Peoria and Des Plaines, which is a Chicago suburb.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you continue elementary? And
I continued. After getting my degree at Murray and starting in elementary, I went to Peabody and got my master's, and about 30 hours beyond the master's.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you retired on an Illinois pension.
That's right.
Well, that is great. Did you like math when you were in elementary school?
I liked it very much. My whole family was math inclined. Mm-hmm. But when I hear the students who are discussing math now, the vocabulary is totally unfamiliar to me. It's changed so much.
Well, I suppose almost every discipline has changed, unless it might be ancient archaeology or some such thing. But in my field of, I suppose they call it the arts in a generalized sort of way, reading as a specialty for newscasters and announcers and so forth. And nearly every student we get, when we tell them they have to have one math course to be graduated from Murray State, they just start screaming, "Oh, no."
That's the way they were by English. When Bob and I lived at Murray, we kept several boys in our apartments, and nobody wanted to take English.
Yeah. The mother tongue.
Yes,
Well,
right.
I can see why everyone needs that, and I suppose we all need at least some fundamentals in mathematics,
Yeah.
and probably.
Maybe not as important as as the English
Well, that would be
for some people.
my particular feeling. Did you have any students that you recall that you were especially? Did you find anybody you predicted might do well and they did, or?
When I was teaching in Benton, the TVA came here, and I was teaching second grade. I enrolled 60 some odd children in the second grade that year.
60?
60 some odd children, but I'm afraid I didn't teach them much. Very difficult.
Don't we have a limit now of about 30 on that, or maybe even less?
All the years I was teaching in Illinois, I would imagine I averaged about 23 students per year, per room. And
well, now, how did that compare? 23 students in a room with teaching 8 grades in one room. About how many did you have then?
probably, I don't recall exactly, but no more than 20, I'd say. I got some help from the older students, but I didn't really know how to teach that many grades at one time. I'm afraid I didn't do a very good job of it. But I did have a lot of help from the older students. I had a lot of discipline problems because I had some children who were very difficult to handle, but you do everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It might be interesting to you, since we're in somewhat the South, not much north, are we?
No, it's a border state, usually called Southern.
I taught 27 years in Illinois, and I never had a black student. I thought that was a little odd.
Well, that is amazing. Now, of course, there are states like North Dakota, some of those areas, to which, for some reason or other, blacks never migrated in any sizable numbers.
Of course, there were a lot in the cities in which I was teaching. It just happened to be that I did not have them in the school. They were going to other schools.
Of course, you have about 40% or more blacks in Chicago, for example.
Yes. Well, the suburbs are different.
Mm-hmm.
Smaller percent in the suburbs.
Yeah. Well, that is an unusual statistic to bring out there. We are used to thinking, when we, at least I am, when Illinois comes to mind, that you have an enormous percentage of blacks in that state.
Especially in the Chicago area.
Uh-huh. Well, in later years, you lived near Chicago. Did you like that area?
Yes, very much. It took me a while to get used to the urban area, but once I felt free to drive and to go by myself wherever I wanted to go, I was happy there.
Well, tell us a little bit about what church was like in the early days. Have there been any particular changes that you can think about?
Well, you know, of course, that I go to the Church of Christ. My grandfather was a minister of the Church of Christ, and my father was
where did he preach? Just various places?
He preached at Oak Valley and in the other churches in the county, and he walked a lot to the...
Now, a lot of times back in those days, in various groups, as well as the Church of Christ, they had preaching once a month.
That's right. And he was often paid by the fruit or vegetables, or by a chicken or such like.
Yeah.
And,
that seems a little unusual now, that you bring home a sack of potatoes or whatever the farmers had in plenty, they would share.
They were generous, and they would take you into their home and give you a good lunch and send you home. most of the time they didn't preach at night because they needed to walk home or get
Mhm.
home the way they had to go.
Yeah.
My step-grandmother was an unusual lady. I would like to say a little bit about her. She was crippled when she was born with a bad hip, and when she was about 40 years old, she fell and broke that hip, and they were never able to properly set it.
Mhm.
So she was married to my grandfather. She'd only been married to my grandfather a little while when she broke the hip. She did all of her work and took care of the grandchildren as if they were her own,
Mhm.
in a rolling chair. And her rolling chair was a plain cane-bottom chair with rollers put in the bottom. And you could hear her rolling for about half a mile away. You could hear the noise. And she was a very wonderful woman.
That is an unusual story. Do you remember your first automobile?
Oh, yes, I do very well. We were living at Calvert City, and Draffen Brothers had a store there. Everybody knows about their store. I don't know whether everybody knows about their automobile business or not, but right beside their store they had a Ford agency.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad bought his first car from them,
Mm-hmm.
and then he began to trade cars. And we quit counting cars when he'd owned something like 56. And he of course had to drive a horse and buggy in the wintertime on the mail route, and he liked spirited horses. So he would go to I'm backtracking, but I guess that's all right.
Surely.
He'd go to the post office and rack his mail, and then he'd bring it down and put it in the buggy, and he'd get somebody to help him harness up the horses, and he'd say, "Turn them loose." I can hear him now. And when he'd turn them loose, they'd go running away, starting on the route, and he said, "They'll calm down by the time I get back."
Yeah, of course. Oh, they had to make runs of, I suppose, 15, 20 miles.
I think a 20-mile route then was about average.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's probably not much different to that today.
I believe they've added mileage. I don't know for sure. I've lost track of that.
Mm-hmm.
They add mileage to increase the salaries,
Yeah. Well, that 30 minutes is nearly gone. We've only got about a minute and a half left. Do you think of anything unusual or funny that you'd like to tell?
Well,
or your most embarrassing moment?
I'll tell you something we laugh about. My mother and her sisters were born at the time they were naming children after states. The states were being added to the Union, at the time, and it seemed to be that many people were named after states. So my mother's name was Louisiana, which she changed to Lula.
Mm-hmm.
One aunt was Elizabethtown, and she changed hers to Nanny.
Mm-hmm.
And one aunt was Augusta, Maine, and she changed her name to Teed.
Yeah.
So we've had lots of laughs about that. We thought maybe they might have chosen better.
Well, I see in old history books, I find a lot of ladies named Kentucky and Tennessee.
Yes, I've noticed that.
And I can recall when I was a boy going to church at Hardin, there was a lady who attended church named Arizona. Arizona Rushing. Very
Yeah.
fine lady. And I always thought that's a little bit of an unusual name. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
I've enjoyed it.
We've been visiting today with our oral history microphone in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Usrey, and we've been talking to Eileen Gillum Usrey, his wife. By the way, I don't think I asked you